Rock and metal invasion. Rock and metal invasion. Rock and metal invasion. Rock and metal invasion.
Hi, welcome to Rock and Metal Invasion. My name is Steve. Coming up on the show today, I am doing the band name is also a band member's last name. Now, before I get into it, I also want to say it's really nice to be back doing shows. Now, if you are a subscriber to the channel, you're a regular watcher of Rock and Metal Invasion, you may have noticed that I have not put out a show for nearly 5 weeks. Unfortunately, I got a little bit sick, actually quite sick, and wasn't really able to do a show. So, and I'm still probably not 100%. You might have noticed if you heard my Ozzy Osbourne episode that I felt compelled to do just because, I mean, Ozzy Osbourne had passed on and I felt like I needed to or wanted to say something about that. But if you saw that episode, or that video, that short video I did, obviously my voice wasn't sounding like it normally does. And like I say, still not necessarily totally better. Hopefully I better get through this episode without coughing or sneezing too much. But yeah, just flu, really bad flu though, and I've been coughing and it's been horrible. But anyway, coming right. So looking forward to getting back to doing regular episodes. So that's that little bit out of the way. Let's get on with the show. So I thought today what I wanted to do was talk about bands and show albums in my collection where the band name is based on one of the band members' surname. Now, sometimes it could be multiple members, so like, brothers or whatever, and their surname is the name of the band. But it's also important that it is a band, so it's not a solo artist who happens to have some people playing with them. It's a proper band, but they've just happened to name this band after the surname of one of the band members. Now, a really good example of that, of course, is Bonjovi. Well, it's quite a good example. Now, this is the debut Bonjovi album from 1984. And, that's, of course, named after the lead vocalist, John Bon Jovi. Now, of course, yes, Bon Jovi is his surname, but it wasn't spelt Bonjovi. It was actually spelled Bongiovi officially. But when he formed the band, for whatever reason, they decided to call the band Bon Jovi with Bon space Jovi. And, of course, arguably, a lot of people would say Bon Jovi, it's really just John Bon Jovi's band, probably now more than ever. But I have to say, I think, in their heyday, in the Slippery When Wet, New Jersey, even through the 90s, the band was known. All the band members were fairly well known. Richie Sambora, I think, had a lot to do with the success of the band as well. And I think you'd have to say it's a proper band. So that's my first example. But like I said, I would not include bands where, like, for example, I wouldn't include a John Bon Jovi album because that's a solo album. There were a couple of other albums that were close, like, for example, Frehley's Comet. Now, that obviously is named after the band, or after the guitarist and vocalist in the band, Ace Frehley, but the band are not called Frehley. They're called Frehley's Comet. So just the fact that they've added the comet to the end, I didn't really want to count that. So this is purely bands where it's the surname of someone in the band then becomes the band name. And actually, this was quite popular throughout the 80s, in particular, especially with hard rock, hair metal bands, quite popular. But I mean, it also goes back to the 70s as well. I'm not quite sure when it first originated, or even how popular it was in the 70s, but I do know that Montrose, for example, that's 1974, I think, when that debut album comes out, so named after the guitarist Ronnie Montrose. So you've got Van Halen as well. So it happened before the 80s, but definitely seemed to be quite popular in the 80s. And of course, a lot of the albums I have in my collection are from the 80s. So I'm going to show you just vinyl records. Actually, there's one CD, but mainly vinyl records that I have in my collection that have the surname of one of the band members that makes the band name up. So the first one was Bon Jovi. That's a fairly well-known one. But I'm also going to show you some slightly less known ones as well. And I'm going to try and do it in sort of alphabetical order. And so next one I'm going to do is Britain, and this is their first album, and it's called Rock Hard. Now, this is a album that is named after Michael Britton, who is the vocalist and guitarist in the band. And this one came out in 1988. And I've got to be honest with you, I'm not a massive fan of the album, but got some good songs. What's most interesting, I think, about this album is it features Gary Holland on drums, who used to be in the band Great White. And even there's even a song on this album called You're the One, which is co-written with Mark Kendall from Great White. So yeah, written by Mark Kendall and Gary Holland, and You're the One is what possibly was at one time going to be a Great White song. But all the rest of the songs are written by the band. I would say Michael Britton probably having quite a bit to do with the songwriting. Now, they put out another couple of albums, I think, after this, but I think this is the only one that's available on vinyl. So Britton and Rock Hard. Next up is Bonum, and this is the debut Bonum album. And, you know, one thing that we'll probably notice as we go through this is not all of the members of the band that have the band named after them are the lead vocalists. So yes, so far the first two, Britton and Bonjovi, are named after the lead vocalist of the band. But in the case of Bonum, we're talking about actually Jason Bonham, who is drummer in the band. So Jason, of course, famous for being the son of Led Zeppelin drummer John Bonham. And the album I just showed you is their debut album. Really good album, actually. Some really good songs on it. Produced by Bob Ezrin. You know, Wait For You and Guilty. Really good songs. There's a follow-up album after that as well called Mad Hatter, which is also good. And, you know, this is actually not even Jason Bonham's major label debut. He was also in a band called Air Race and Virginia Woolf prior to that. But really, Bonham, I think, was the band that got him had the most success with up until that point, at least. Now, unfortunately, after Mad Hatter, the band sort of break up. Jason Bonham actually goes on and joins the band or forms the band Motherland, which is really good. It came out in '94, a little bit grungy, but not too. I wouldn't call it grunge. That's a really good album. And then he also put together a band he just called the Jason Bonham Band throughout the late '90s. And of course, up to quite recently, he's been drumming with Sammy Hagar. Now, sadly, the vocalist in Bonham, Daniel McMaster, passed away in 2008. All right, next up, I'm going to call this a band, even though the band is named after a very well-known singer, and I'm going to talk about Diano. Yes, so Diano, this is his debut. Well, this is the debut Diano album. Of course, Diano is named after Paul Diano, the lead vocalist of the band, and also, of course, most well known as having been the vocalist or lead vocalist in Iron Maiden. But I think this is a proper band. You can see that on the album cover, all 5 members of the band are pictured. Now, this is a one and done. It's more AOR, melodic, hard rock, definitely nothing like Iron Maiden. So if you're checking this out and you're expecting it to sound like some, an Iron Maiden album, like Killers or something like that, no. But I'd really like it. But like I say, one and done. After that, he then went on and put out a couple of albums that I thought were also really good, a little bit heavier though, under the name Battle Zone, and also Killers as well. He's put out albums under that name as well. Next one, a classic, but I had to include it. Dio and Holy Diver. Of course, Dio go on to put out a number of albums. This is the first of their classic albums that they put out in the 80s. I mean, for me, their first 4 albums are definitely classic albums. But I'm also going to say, although, yes, some might say, again, a little bit like Bon Jovi, oh, come on, it's really just a Ronnie James Dio album, solo album. But, there's some big well-known players, or at least they become well-known players on that album, like specifically Vivian Campbell on guitar, but you've also got Vinny Appice on drums. And I think that this is a real band effort. I'm sure Ronnie was probably doing a lot of the heavy lifting, but I think a classic band, a classic album, and I wanted to include that. So yeah, Dio and Holy Diver. Next one. All right, next one, another well-known band, Dokken and Breaking the Chains. So this is the debut Dokken album. Dokken, of course, named after lead vocalist Don Dokken. Now, the interesting, of course, with this band, or this album, the first Dokken album, it actually features Juan Crucier on bass. So this is before Jeff Pilson comes into the band, and this is, of course, before Juan Crucier joins Rat. But otherwise, you've got Wild Mick Brown, you've got George Lynch, and of course Don Dokken on vocals. And this is very much a band, even though, of course, it's named after the lead vocalist Don Dokken. George Lynch, a really big part of the band, of course. And they put out quite a few albums, classic albums, throughout the 80s, but ended up eventually breaking up, I think, around 88 after their live album was put out. And then, interestingly enough, I think, my understanding is Don then wanted to put out his album Up From the Ashes, which is a great album. It would have actually fitted really nicely into the Dokken discography. It would have fitted in quite well. Sure, you would have missed George Lynch's guitar playing, but it did sound fairly similar to the other Dokken albums. He wasn't able to put it out as Dokken, even though it's his name. He had to put it out as Don Dokken because, you know, Dokken was actually a band, not a solo venture, which is, I guess, the whole point of this. I'm sort of highlighting the fact that, yes, it's named after someone in the band, but it's still a band. So he wasn't able to. And I always thought it would have been interesting if, you know, maybe George Lynch, Jeff Pilson, and maybe Mick Brown, maybe they'd actually even managed to get the rights to the name Dokken. I wonder if they could have put out an album and called it Dokken, even though Don's not in the band. Probably wouldn't have really made a lot of sense. But yeah, I wonder if they could have actually done that. In the end, they actually reform and, you know, as Dokken, and then of course they split up again. But now it seems as though Don Dokken just is able to release albums under the name Dokken. But yeah, there we go, Dokken, and that's named after lead vocalist Don Dokken, who's still touring and putting out albums to this day. Next one, Fortune, and this one came out in 1985. Really good melodic hard rock, AOR, produced by Kevin Beamish. There's the band there. Some really good songs on here. Through It All is, I think, a fantastic song, but actually the only album that they put out in the 80s. Now, this is named after the guitar player, Richard Fortune, but I think one of the really important members of the band is a guy called L.A. Green, who is the lead vocalist. And he sounds really good. And actually, he goes on to form a band called Alan Cage, who put out some really good albums, I think, throughout the late 90s, early 2000s. Really worth checking out. And yeah, so that's L.A. Green. I think it might be called Larry Green officially, but and he put out some really good albums with Alan Cage. Sadly, he actually passed away in 2022. But Fortune did I think before he passed, put out their second album, like, you know, 35 years later, they put out their second album in around 2020 or 2021. But yeah, this is the only one that I have in my collection, and it's worth checking out, named after Richard Fortune, the guitarist. Gillan and Mr. Universe. Now, this is the second Gillan album, but the only Gillan album I actually have in my collection. Came out in 1978, I'm pretty sure, and I really like the title track, Mr. Universe. Of course, Ian Gillan, most well known for being the vocalist in Deep Purple, but, you know, I think this is a proper band. I mean, it's got some big names on here that are quite well known. Bernie Tormé, of course, on guitar, John McCoy on bass, Colin Towns keyboards, and Mick Underwood drums. But yeah, so some really well-known musicians on this one. And I think, you know, I don't, like I say, it's the only album I've got in my collection, but they do put out a few more albums in the early 80s. And I do know that Martin Popoff really likes the Gillan albums. So I do want to make some time to check those out. But definitely I love the title track, Mr. Universe, really good. All right, next one I want to talk about is a band called Jafria. Now, this is the debut Jafria album, named, of course, after Greg Jafria, who is actually the keyboard player. So that's the first time we've had a band who have the surname of the band member named that is the keyboard player. Now, he, of course, was at one time in the band Angel. And yeah, Greg Jafria then forms this band Jafria. Now, I actually saw Greg Jafria do an interview recently with the hair metal guru. It was a really great interview because I've not actually really heard Greg Jafria do an interview before. It was quite long, like almost 3 hours, but it was really interesting to, you know, they went back and talked about his time with Jafria and then also his time forming House of Lords. And what I found the most interesting was there's not a lot of love for James Christian from Greg Jafria. Not a lot of love there. Of course, James Christian comes in as vocalist for House of Lords. And the debut House of Lords was originally at one point going to be the third Jafria album. So the Jafria put out 2 albums, and that the third Jafria album, and they even recorded some songs. Of course, they had David Glenn Isley. David Glenn Isley is the vocalist in Jafria, and he did even record some songs for the third Jafria album. In fact, that's actually just been released quite recently on CD, sort of like the Lost Third album, so you can check that out. But and I think that was one of the reasons that Greg Jafria was doing his interview with the hair metal guru, but just sort of promoting that. But yeah, so, you know, and that features David Glenn Isley on vocals. So, but yeah, so it's, you know, one of those interesting situations too, where, you know, House of Lords is really Jafria's band, decides to, and probably a wise choice. I think Gene Simmons might have had something to do with it, changing the name, because Jafria is kind of maybe hard for people to read or understand or say. So changed it to House of Lords, and they also get in a new vocalist. A few other couple, there's also other member changes as well. But, you know, even though, you know, Greg formed the band or carried on the Jafria and just changed the name to House of Lords, he doesn't have any rights to the name of the band, it seems, anymore. And it's just pretty much House of Lords is now appears to be James Christian's band, and they continue to put out lots of albums throughout the 2000s. I think all of them on Frontiers Records. But anyway, going back to Jafria, these are really good. If you like House of Lords, you will probably quite enjoy the 2 Jafria albums. Next one is Keel. So this is named after Ron Keel, who is the vocalist. There he is there in the band. Now, he initially, I think, was in a band called Steeler with Yngwie Malmsteen, but then forms the band Keel. Now, this is the 4th album, I think, that they put out. That's probably my favorite Keel album. I think it's really good. Produced by Michael Wagner. United Nations is a great song. Somebody's Waiting, really good. I think there's a music video for that one. Lots of really good, loud gang vocals in this one. It's like big, loud gang background vocals. Yeah, you can definitely hear that on this album. So yeah, like I said, this is their 4th album. They put out one more after this, and then that's sort of it for a while. But then there have been a few releases since then, and of course, you know, Ron Keel's still going to this day. Next up, a band called London and Playa del Rock. Now, there was no one in this band who has a surname London. The reason I am showing you this album and talking about it is because there are versions of this album where it's not called London. The band is not called London. They are called The Priest. So the album Playa del Rock is released under the band name The Priest, which is named after the lead singer Nada the Priest. So that I thought was kind of interesting. Now, this is the only London album I actually have, and also I don't have a copy of the Playa del Rock album with the band name The Priest. You can only get it, I think, on CD and cassette, so there's actually no vinyl version with it having that name. But I'm not quite sure why it got changed. I guess, you you know, London had also been around for quite some time, kind of known as a band that was good at sort of famous for all the people who had been in the band. They've gone on to bigger things. But anyway, like I said, yeah, lots of famous people in and out of the band. I think Becky Lawless was in it at one point, Nikki Sixx. But yeah, really unusual situation. I don't think I know of any other situation when an album has been released with two different band names. The same album, I think initially it was probably released as London and then got changed to Depressed. And then, you know, this comes out, I think, around 1989. And, or no, it says 89/1990. And then, of course, this type of music's kind of not very popular for a while. So that's pretty much the end of the band, at least for a while. Now, you might have, of course, if you've seen the decline of Western civilization, you would have seen the band London and Nada Depressed in that as well. Next up, Maltese and Count Your Blessings. So this is female-fronted heavy metal, came out in 1990. I'm not sure exactly how easy it was to find in 1990 or how many copies were out. I don't think very many, because this is actually a reissue on No Remorse Records from 2022. It's got 8 songs, although, you know, Blessed Other Strong is kind of repeated twice. It's got a reprise of that song as track 4 on side 2. So 7 songs, so not a lot. Now, this is their debut album, though, and prior to this, they had just released a EP. And the band Maltese are named after the lead vocalist. It's female-fronted Barbara Maltese. It sounds really good. My go-to song on this album is Count Your Blessings. Really good. I think you can find a music video for that. Really good song. Like I said, this isn't really hair metal. It's pretty heavy, probably just 80s metal, although this is 1990 release. You know, that sort of sound, tough sound. I think haven't heard their EP. I think that might not have been quite so good, not quite so heavy. They got a different lineup, I think, when they put out this album. And yeah, like I say, the band is named after the lead vocalist, Barbara Maltese. Although her name officially, her surname didn't actually have Z in it. I think it was spelled with an S, but I, thought it'd be cooler for it to have a Z in it. So, and they called the band Maltese. But yeah, great that this has got a reissue, because it is definitely worth checking out. Up the band Nelson. Now, I don't actually have an album on vinyl or even a CD from the band Nelson, but I do have a 7-inch single. So this is Can't Live Without Your Love and Affection, which I think was a bit of a hit for them. But the main reason I got this is the B-side, Will You Love Me, is actually a really good song. So Nelson, of course, are named after, I think they're twins. So Matt and Gunnar Nelson. And they're actually they're the sons of a well-known singer-musician called Ricky Nelson. And yeah, this was a bit of a hit. It came out 1990, I think, on Geffen. This song was a hit. The album did fairly well, but then that was kind of it. And they didn't have a lot more success after this. Like I say, I'm not a big fan. I've only just got this 7-inch single. They were very much pop metal, very, very, not really hard rock, not even that hard, not that heavy. But they have put out a number of albums, after this, but none of them had the success that their debut album had. All right, next one is a slightly more obscure band. This is Swiss band Paganini, that's how you say it, Weapon of Love. And it is named after the lead vocalist, Mark Paganini. Now, this is their debut album, and it's actually the only album of theirs I have in my collection. I have heard the follow-up album as well, called It's a Long Way to the Top. It was all right, and this is just okay. But, I remember hearing it back in the day. I had it back in the day, so happy to have it in my collection, but not a big fan. They also put out a third album in 1990 called Detox. The first 2 albums, however, though, are on the Vertigo label, so on a major label. And I think maybe they put out some other albums as well in the 2000s. But yeah, like I say, not a massive fan, but yeah, do have their debut album. And the band gets its name from the lead vocalist, Mark Paganini. Next up is a band called Riggs. And this is a one and done band. This album came out in 1982. And this band probably most well known for having a song on the heavy metal soundtrack. And the band is named after Jerry Riggs, who, interesting enough, is now currently touring with 38 Special. And he also played on the Pat Travis album from 1984 called Hot Shot. And I know that some people really like this album. I actually, to be honest, am kind of new to it, but I will be checking it out a little bit more. But yeah, so there we go. Riggs, and named after Jerry Riggs from 1982. And there's the band in the back. All right, next one is a band called Roxus and their album Night Street. Now, I recently did an episode where I considered this a grail. I added it quite recently to my collection. And it is a grail because it's very hard to find on vinyl. Here's the band at the back. Now, this is an Australian band, and they are named after the lead vocalist, Juno Roxus. Now, this is a one and done as well, but they did put out an EP, and they've also got some 7-inch singles as well. My go-to song is Rock and Roll Nights. I think that's a fantastic song. But they also put out some singles that I think definitely had some hit potential, but that ended up being the only album that they put out. The next one I'm going to show is a band called Santas, and this is the album Guitar Alley. This is their third album, and the band are named after the guitarist in the band, Rick Santas, who also does the vocals, and also the drummer, Mick Santas. So it's one of those brother type situations. Now, the album I showed you is their third album. Really good stuff. Their second album is probably even better. It's called Racing Time. It was their second album, and pretty much they're one of those Canadian bands who were doing proto hair metal. So, putting out albums that would sound like hair metal before hair metal really had taken off. So really good stuff. Now, there's 3 albums I think you can get on vinyl. There is also a 4th album, but that didn't come out until 1998. I think it's called Top Secrecy. I don't have it, but it is actually, although it came out in 1998, the unreleased 4th album that they had recorded in 1986. Next one I want to talk about is a band I've done a whole episode on, Soraya, and this is their debut album released in 1989. They also released a second album, When the Blackbird Sings, in 1991, and then that's been it. But both those albums are fantastic, really good hard rock. Really love both of the albums equally, as probably as I've sort of discussed in the past. Now, the band name comes from the lead vocalist. It's female fronted, and the lead vocalist is Sandy. So it's named after her, Sandy Soraya. And like I said, just those 2 albums, but they're both really good. Now, the album I showed you is their debut album, but on their second album, they have a new bass player comes in called Barry Dunaway, who actually has a bit in common with the guy I was talking about before, Jerry Riggs. So I was talking about Jerry Riggs. Well, they've actually both, Jerry Riggs and Barry Dunaway, had both played on the Pat Travis album Hot Shot in 1984. And interestingly enough, both Jerry Riggs and Barry Dunaway are now currently playing in the band 38 Special. Right, next up, now this is the one CD I'm going to show on this episode because I don't have a vinyl of this band. And the band I'm talking about is Sinner. So I've only got one Sinner album, and this is it. There Will Be Execution. So I've got this on CD. I think this one came out around, in the 2000s sometime. So it's not an 80s release, but these guys put out a lot of albums in the 80s, and I would like to get them on vinyl at some point. They're a German band, and they're named after the lead vocalist, Matt Sinner, who, I think he's also been in a number of other bands or produced or written for other bands as well. Quite a busy guy, actually. What I do have, though, I do have Matt Sinner. This is his one and only sort of solo album, so it doesn't count. But he released this solo album, Back to the Bullet, in 1990. But there's a whole lot of Sinner albums from the 1980s you can get on vinyl, and then they just carry on putting out a number of albums, since then. Yeah, I wanted to mention them again, just like, a lot of those German bands in the 80s that they certainly had a bit of a hair metal image if you look at their photos from the 80s, but they were quite a heavy band, but still, definitely not thrash or anything like that. So, if you like that sort of heavy hair metal, like those German bands, a lot of those German European bands did quite well, they're worth checking out. And like I say, don't have any Sinner on vinyl. The 80s albums, I would like to rectify that, and hopefully I'll get some very soon. Next up, a platinum selling band, Slaughter. Well, at least this album went platinum. This is the debut album from Slaughter, of course, fronted by Mark Slaughter. He's the vocalist. Most well known prior to this album as being the vocalist for Vinnie Vincent Invasion or the All Systems Go album. He was the lead singer. Not on the debut album. They had a different singer on the debut album for Vinnie Vincent Invasion, but he does appear on the Boys Are Gonna Rock music video. But yeah, so this is the debut Slaughter album. Also, of course, got Diano who'd also been in Vinnie Vincent. And yeah, this album did really well. Of course, Up All Night was a bit of a hit for them. And they also they then released The Wildlife after this, and a number of other albums throughout the 90s, but then not too much since the 2000s. But they're still touring and playing live, so there is that. Winger, so of course named after the lead vocalist in the band, Kip Winger. This is their debut album. They put 3 albums out on the Atlantic label. 3 great albums, especially their third album, Pull, but that came out in 1993, so it wasn't easy for them to get much attention, and the only attention they were getting was attention from, Beavis and Butthead making fun of them, or, Lars from Metallica throwing darts at them, so it wasn't really the kind of attention they wanted, which was really unfortunate, because although I say it's named after Kip Winger, the whole band is great, a band of great musicians, great musicianship, and yeah, really good stuff. And of course, obviously things were tough for them in the early 90s, but they've got back together, and throughout the 2000s they've been putting out really good albums and are still touring, although it sounds like they might be winding up touring fairly soon. Kip, of course, very busy doing his orchestral music as well, so classical music. He's a composer, so yeah, very talented guy. Next one is Van Zant, and this is their album that came out in 1985 it's on the Geffen label, Geffen Records. Now, this is named after the lead singer, Johnny Van Zant, who's now, of course, in Lynyrd Skynyrd. Of course, his brothers had also been in that band as well. But this is not Southern rock. This is, mid-80s hard rock, very much sounding a bit like, early Bon Jovi. So if you like that type of sound, you will like this album. Some good songs on here. My go-to song is I'm a Fighter, which interestingly enough was not written by the band, but was written by Jimmy Jamison and Mandy Meyer. And that was when they were in a band called Cobra. So now it doesn't feature on the debut Cobra album, but Jimmy Jamison and Mandy Meyer maybe were writing songs for the second Cobra album, I'm not too sure. And one of the songs anyway that they wrote, and they did perform it live as well, was I'm a Fighter. But yeah, of course, Jimmy goes on to join Survivor as the lead vocalist. And the song ends up going to Van Zant, and there's even a music video they did for that song as well. Really good song. And yeah, like I say, if you like that sort of mid-80s hard rock sound, melodic AOR even, it's not super heavy, but I like it. Some good songs on it. Yeah, worth checking out. So that's Van Zant. And of course, there was Johnny Van Zant band as well prior to this, but that was more of a sort of, I'm going to consider that more solo. This is the only actual Van Zant album that is sort of fit. Actually, there's more, but this was the only one that I think really fits the sort of hard rock category. Well, that's all for today. I've gone through some bands where one of the band members, at least one of the band members, has their surname as the band name. Now, you're probably thinking, well, Steve, where's your Van Halen? Where's your Montrose? Well, I've got a whole lot of examples like that I'm probably going to do another show on, and it'll be where the band name is the guitarist's surname, and it's not a solo band. In other words, yes, obviously some guitarists have solo albums that come out, but it's still a band, but the guitarist is kind of like a big part of the deal, big part of the band, and maybe the band is named after them. So it just was going to be too long a show to also carry on with that, because I've got quite a good pile of those ones as well. So I pretty much restricted myself to, on this episode, band names from band members who aren't really, there are some guitar players, but a lot of them were either drummers or the lead vocalist. That was certainly a big part of the people who I chose for this episode. Anyway, if you enjoy this type of content, make sure you hit the thumbs up. Make sure you hit the subscribe. My subscribing numbers haven't been going up much recently, of course, because I haven't been doing shows. But now I'm back doing shows. If you haven't subscribed, can you please do me a favor? Hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, and I will be back much sooner than I have been for this show. And I'll see you soon. All right, catch you later. Bye.